Avanzando con nuestra agenda, invitamos a Team Schittekatte, de MIT Energy Initiative, quien está a cargo de la siguiente conferencia.
Electricity sector policy reforms to support efficient decarbonization.
Schittekatte es ingeniero industrial de la Universidad Gant en Bélgica y completó el programa EMIN con una maestría internacional en economía. Tiene un doctorado en economía energética de la Universidad París Sud 11 y es científico investigador en la iniciativa de energía de MIT. Actualmente trabaja en la investigación de mercado eléctrico en tiempos de crisis y las tarifas minoristas de la electricidad para la descarbonización de toda la economía. Ha publicado artículos académicos sobre estos temas que conducen a diálogos frecuentes con las instituciones relevantes como la Comisión Europea, la ACER, la CPUC y Ofgem, el regulador de Gran Bretaña. Bienvenido.
Hello, everyone. Thank you very much for having me. So I'm Tim Schittekatte. I'm from MIT. I'm also a professor at the Florence School of Regulation in Italy. So I want to thank Andek for having me. Hablo un poco de español, pero el mío inglés es mejor. Así lo hago en inglés. So I'm going to talk about efficient decarbonization and what that means for the regulation of the power sector. So my presentation consists out of 4 parts. First, I will talk about general worldwide trends, which we see in energy and specifically in electricity. Then I'll talk about what that means for power markets. I'll focus on adequacy, reliability, and affordability, which I think are 3 very important, I would say, criteria. Then I'll talk a little bit about networks, if we still got time. And then I will formulate takeaways, conclusions of my talk. So general trends. So this is a figure from the International Energy Association. And it was published in their big report on net zero emissions by 2050. And the key thing in this figure is that when we look at the energy sector, it's gonna be more and more electric. So what you can see on this slide is the energy use in industry, transport, and buildings, and how that is fulfilled with electricity, which is in the orange, and how that is fulfilled with something else, meaning gas, coal, or whatever you want. And as you can see, as time passes by, we will see large electrification of buildings, heat pumps, and so on, transport, electrical vehicles, but also maybe marine and aviation even, and in industry. Industrial heat will also be electrified. I think the IEA is a bit conservative here. They say by 2050 at a world level of all energy use, about 51% will be electric, while today it's about 20%. I think that number will be rather 70 or 80%. And the remainder will be sync fuels, hydrogen, whatever you want, or maybe carbon capture and storage and still fossil fuels. Now, if you look at how that looks like in different parts of the world, like the amount of electricity demand, you can see that in the advanced economies, electricity usage will rise, but that in the emerging market, that rise will be even more spectacular. That was also already mentioned in the previous panel. So one thing is we're gonna electrify a lot. We're gonna electrify industry, we're gonna electrify buildings, and transport. The other thing is, while we do that, we're gonna make our electricity generation more sustainable. So these are numbers from the US and the new generation that have been installed over the last 20 years. And you see a clear trend here, where we go from, in the early 2000s, there's still a lot of addition of gas units, some coal units, but in the last couple of years, the majority of new generation that has been installed is almost entirely wind, solar, and batteries. And this is the picture of the US. You can see similar pictures in Europe, Australia, and other parts of the world. So there is still some investment into fossil fuel generators, but the shift is clear and is expected to only continue. It's just a matter of timing. So what does that mean? What does that mean for the power market? Here you see prices from ERCOT, so this is Texas, hourly day-ahead prices in several years. Here you can see typical daily prices over the different years in California. What you can see here is that there's a large amount of volatility in prices. There's a few hours or a few days in the year where prices are very high, where the system is very tight. In other times of the year, prices are very low. What you can see from California is that it's already very clear that within the day, the value of electricity is changing massively. California has a lot of solar. What that means is electricity becomes very cheap during the day, but very expensive in the early evening. That was not true in 2012, 2014, but it is true today. So what that means is that there's a lot of value in being very dispatchable, and there's a lot of value in demand reacting to, please don't charge your car at 7 p.m., charge it during noon or somewhere in the night. So these are power prices today. What we will see in the future, and this is a report from MIT that was published recently, is that the volatility of power prices is only expected to increase. So what does this figure tell you? These are prices from ERCOT 2018, 2019. Almost all the prices, they have been between $5 and $50 per megawatt hour, which is kind of the normal range. There were a few hours where prices were quite a bit higher, as you could see from the graph. But if we go to the future with more and more renewables, and those are just different scenarios of more renewables, what we will see is more and more hours where the price of power is actually near zero when we just have enough renewables, and if more hours when the price of electricity is very, very high. And this is something that we'll see more and more. So the distribution of power prices will massively expand. It will become a lot more volatile. So there's a lot of value in dispatch, coordination, demand response, all these kind of things. This is how the future will look like, probably all over the world. Now, what does it mean? There's been a sort of discussion, and this is kind of, I would say, opinions from the EU and from the US, saying that, but in this world with a lot of renewables, how will we have that spot market, day-ahead market still working? Because these prices will be hugely, unpredictable, a lot of zero prices and then very high prices and so on. Maybe we should get rid of the spot markets, of the day-ahead market, blow them up, as said by the former Ministry of Economy in Greece. On the other hand, you have the opinion of Harvard professor William Hogan, who says that in that world that we're entering, actually the value of electricity markets, the importance, will only increase because it becomes extremely more complicated to really coordinate generation, networks, storage, demand. So you need a market-based system in order to coordinate that. So therefore, I'm on the side of Professor Hogan. In this future, with more and more renewables, we will need the electricity markets even more than we need them today. Even though the moment you have a period of very high prices, this will happen. This will be in the newspaper. But I hope that this, in the end, will prevail. Now, that doesn't mean that spot markets, the day-ahead market, the real-time market, intraday market, cannot be improved. So there has been a paper published by actually colleagues from me at MIT, maybe you know Carlos Batlle, who looks at the spot market design in Colombia. It's already quite advanced, but there's certain things that still can be improved. But it's an idea of gradually improving those things, then doing something radically different. And what is one of the main points in that paper is that it is a good idea to start with financial commitments in the day-ahead market, to have an intraday market, and to have balancing markets with real financial stakes. If you in the day-ahead market tell me you're going to produce X amount of megawatt hours tomorrow at 7 and you produce less, well, you got to pay for it. These kind of ideas that how the market can be further improved. Now, what we see in Europe, and these prices become more volatile, it becomes harder and harder for those renewables to make their business case. So on top of the spot market, we see long-term contracts being procured. And there are two types of long-term contracts which are very important. One is PPAs. So what you can see here is the amount of PPAs in Europe. These are power purchase agreements. These are deals between renewable developers and companies or utilities or even the Walmarts or the Amazons to say, okay, I'm willing to give you a contract for 20 years, and then you build your renewable power plant, and you're going to deliver that renewable energy for 20 years for a pre-agreed price to me. As such, I'm sure that I'm going to get my cheap renewable energy, and you are sure of your business case of investing. This is increasing and increasing. What you also see is a strong role of the government. These are statistics from the UK, and the amount of wind, especially wind, where contracts have been auctioned off, which are backed up by the government. So these are multiple gigawatts, especially offshore wind, where the government generates an auction for a long-term contract. It asks developers to come, then they bid in, get that contract for 15 or 20 years. But these contracts, they build on top of a well-functioning spot market. These are there to make sure that those business cases are viable. But in the coordination, in the dispatch, you still need that day-ahead price, intraday price, real-time price, in order to, if there's too much wind, curtail some wind. If there's too little energy, to make sure that everybody's ready to dispatch, to make sure that maintenance is done at the right times. So these long-term contracts work in tandem with the spot market. Now, how to ensure in such a future where we will see more and more renewables, it's a matter of timing, adequacy, which means, will you have enough generation capacity to meet the expected peak demand? I think that is a massive question in Colombia with the El Niño phenomenon and so on. Will we have enough when there is not enough water, not enough wind, not enough sun? This is the adequacy question. The second question is reliability. Will we have enough real-time flexibility in the system to make sure that we always have a safe enough operation of the system? This is the reliability question, which becomes more complicated in a renewable world. The third question is affordability. Will we make sure that consumers like you and I, their bills are manageable? Because the moment you have a couple of months, and you know it very well, of very high prices, politicians come in, and you have the risk that the whole market system gets broken down due to political reaction, which are fed by, I would say, social concerns on unmanageable bills. So it's extremely important to get affordability right. So all these three criteria, how are we going to fulfill them in that high renewable system? First, adequacy. This is Professor Paul Josko. He's one of my, I would say, colleagues. It's a bit of an honor to call him a colleague at MIT. And he writes on, okay, how can we make sure that we have enough investment or enough capacity retainment in this high renewable system? And what he says is we'll need something on top of just energy markets. We'll need capacity markets and so on, because it becomes more and more complicated to make the business case for these units that you only need sometimes, but when you need them, you really, really need them. So this is the status, and there's a lot of stuff on this graph, of different countries in Europe, different states in the US, and different countries in Latin America that have capacity markets. And what you can see on this graph, and I'm not going to go in detail, is that there's a tendency towards more and more capacity markets. What you can also see on this graph is that there's a lot of colors. And what that means is that everybody does it slightly different. It's probably not a good idea. And here in Latin America, you can see that Colombia, together with Mexico, is one of the few that has market-based capacity products, the so-called reliability options. Almost all the countries in Europe and almost all the states in the US use similar mechanisms in order to pay for capacity to make sure that you have that capacity in place to generate when you really need it. This is an important graph, and here you can see the importance of capacity payments versus energy prices for generators. What you can see is that in Europe, the capacity markets are not that an important source of revenue. Only a part of the costs are covered by capacity mechanisms. It's often small. It's actually quite high in Ireland and UK. That's because they're islands. It's just harder to have capacity in an island than a big continent. In the US, capacity markets are very, very important. With the exception of ERCOT, the amount of capacity payments are very high, and they seem to be only rising. What I found in a paper looking at firm capacity payments in Colombia is that they're about 16% or so of the total revenues on average of generators. Well, this is a bit in line, I would say something in the middle between the US and the EU in terms of the reliance on capacity payments for your business case. So you're somewhere right in the middle between those two. What becomes more and more important in that future world is also the demand. What you can see here is a rich person who has a nice EV, a Tesla wall, and a solar panel. Well, what you want is that in times of system stress, those people will actually help the system rather than disconnect and isolate themselves from the system. So you need more and more mechanisms at the moment that there is high system stress to leverage the flexibility in demand. And every country around the world is facing problems with that. But if you're able to tell your consumers, like they do here in California, it's very hot, please reduce your consumption, otherwise the system will go down. These things are very powerful and can save out a lot of money. So here there's a lot of theoretical papers. It goes back to the 80s on how to engage demand in making sure that you don't have those blackouts the moment you really have a deficit of energy. This is something that we have to work on. It's very complicated, but it's an important part of the puzzle. So this was adequacy. Now we go over to reliability, which is more of an engineering, technical thing. This is David Newbury, who's one of probably the most important professor in the UK on energy regulation and the power system. And what he says is that in this old world, with a lot of thermal generation and a lot of synchronous generation, some attributes of power generators were taken for granted, in the sense that synchronous machines, they deliver inertia, they deliver voltage support, they deliver fast ramping. Those things have always been considered abundant and for free, but in that new world that we're entering, they might become more scarce, more valuable, and they should be priced. So that is what is meant with missing markets. It means that somebody is very important for your system, but you're not really paying them for it, so in the end, they might not really do it anymore, and then you run into trouble. This is Australia. This is the system frequency in Australia. It should be 50 hertz. You can see it that it's kind of jumping a bit around 50 hertz, like every power system. But you can see what happens in 2012 and what happens in 2019. So the amount of frequency deviations have been massively increased because what happened in Australia, in 5 years' time, many coal units went out, some renewables came in, and they didn't have enough fast generation anymore to make sure that the frequency remains within their boundaries. So what did they do when they noticed this problem, which is a big problem, because if you don't manage this, then there's a massive blackout and the whole thing goes down. they increased the amount of capacity that they pay for frequency regulation, and the prices for frequency regulation also improved. So if you don't pay for frequency regulation or you don't price it well, you can get in those troubles, and then you only need one hit at the wrong time, one unit goes down, one line goes down, and the whole system is in trouble. This is Ireland. Ireland is an island with massive amount of wind. I think they already have on average, I could be wrong, 50% of their generation wind. They have hours where they have 80% of their generation wind. What they have been doing is, damn, we have all that wind. We don't have much gas and coal anymore. We don't have inertia anymore, which is a big problem because the moment you have an imbalance and you don't have a very inert system, you get very, very unstable. So what they're doing now is they're having auctions to procure inertia because it used to be abundant, so it was cheap, but it has always been important. And if something that is important becomes scarce, it becomes very valuable. So therefore now they have inertia procurement in their systems, which is probably the first in the world that is doing that. This is a map of Europe. What you can see here is which countries are paying for voltage support. So there's some countries like my own home country, Belgium, this one, which is actually starting to create markets for voltage support. Because again, when you have more and more renewables and you don't have all these synchronous generators anymore, voltage becomes an issue. So voltage has to be priced. Same thing. So this is where we are going to. All these attributes of certain generators which are vital for the system that used to be abundant become scarce, have to be priced. If not, you'll run into trouble. So affordability. This is the price of natural gas, the TTF, in Europe in the last 2 years. What you can see is bad things happened. Prices went through the roof. And as a consequence, also day-ahead prices for electricity followed suit. Here you can see the prices in different countries of Europe and how they nicely follow what happens in the gas market. This is when Europe noticed something is off. Russia is not filling its reserves. This is when the Ukraine invasion happened. It's surprisingly not the highest peak. This is when Europe was afraid that the next summer they won't have enough gas and they would have to ration gas and ration electricity. Prices have been rising, average for a month, 500 euro per megawatt hour. That is 10 times the normal price. Gas prices have been rising more than 10 times the normal price. Households have been paying 5 to 7 times the electricity bill that they're used to pay. You can imagine that this created a lot of public rage on why the hell do we see these very high power prices if the problem is in the gas market? So there has been a lot of pressure on power market design. Now, here you can see some tweets. In the UK, during that period, suddenly the median UK citizen became energy poor. That's really bad. What you can also see in Europe is that a lot of industry has been having to shut down and might have relocated, which is very bad from a macroeconomic perspective and is very bad in terms of jobs and overall economic prosperity. So this has been a huge issue. What have governments been doing? Well, they have been spending a lot of public support. Germany being the champion with more than about 7 to 8% of their GDP being used to mitigate energy price shocks for consumers and households. 7% of GDP. That is a massive number. Not everybody is as rich as Germany, so the other countries had to do it with less. But in the end, there has been massive amount of public funding, and that came right after COVID, where we also had already a massive amount of public spending. So this has really put a big pressure on the European economy. This is not something purely European. Here you can see prices for Colombia for the last, more than 20 years, 25 years. You have also seen your periods of very high prices. Well, the problem in Europe was that we might be running out of gas, while the problem in Colombia has been we might be running out of water. Basically, same kind of problem, different problem, similar consequence. Periods of very high prices with a lot of pressure on households, consumers, and on the politics in the end, with the potential danger that the whole power market compound would be destroyed because of political reactions. Now, we have been working at this at MIT, and we have introduced a new product that we have been advertising in order to kind of avoid such an affordability issue without destroying the power market. We call it an affordability option, which is a consumer bill protection without consumers and generators being mute. I don't have enough time to go into the detail, but the idea is that the regulator organizes an auction, and in that auction, it auctions off options, Asian options, that are settled on a monthly basis with a strike price being equal to the affordable bill of consumers. And what will happen is if you have periods of some high prices, like you see here in Spain, but the average price is not very high, the option is not exercised. So consumers and generators still very much react to these nice scarcity signals. In periods where the average price is very high, the option is exercised, and the ones who have been selling this option, they have to pay whatever the difference is between the average price and the strike price. As such, you create an insurance for consumers, because consumers, they don't care that the prices are high for a few hours. They care that the prices are high on average for a longer period, because that's what you see in the bill. And generators, they want to exchange the risk of these waiting for those periods of high prices to make their business case. Instead, they can get a stable option premium. So this is something to complete the market. We have been advertising this option to the European Commission, Acer, and all the different regulators in Europe, and also have been in the press, in The Economist, Bloomberg, and all kind of news outlets in order to make sure that the next time this happens, we are better protected while we keep that very, very valuable power market in place. So if you want to read more, we wrote loads of papers, more than hundreds of pages, on what exactly to do in periods of crisis. Now, I was talking mostly about power markets, so about adequacy, getting enough investment to make sure that you have enough generation when you really need it. I talked about reliability, making sure that you have enough flexibility in the system to not have operational issues. I talk about affordability, mechanisms to make sure that some periods of sustained high prices don't create that affordability issues on consumers and the political turmoil. Now I'll talk a little bit about networks, because investment in networks will make the job to achieve those three criteria, adequacy, reliability, affordability, a lot easier. So this is statistics from, again, the International Energy Association. It is expected on a world level that in the next decade, the amount of annual spending on networks will increase with 200%. And this will last for the decades to come. So if today we are spending 10 million, whatever, or $10 billion on networks, well, within on an annual basis, next decade that will be 30. That's a massive increase. And this is mostly because we have more and more demand for electricity. This is the main driver, electrification. You can already see this in the US. So this is the US and the spending categories of the average utility. What you can see that in the 2010s, most of the money spent in the sector was on the production of electricity, investment in generation and fuel and so on. But what has been happening in the last 20 years is that the importance of spending of networks, distribution and transmission, has already significantly increased. And this is only expected to be increased. So I talked a bit about production here, that we don't know whether it will be more costly to produce electricity now and compared to the next decade. But what we do know is that the volatility of the value of electricity production will be massively increased. What we do know about networks is that there will just be a lot more money spent on them. This is a study from the US, where they look at, if we want to decarbonize the US as a whole, how much will it cost if we don't do any network upgrades, if we do a little bit of network upgrades, or if we have this massive network in place? Well, they find that the money saved or the amount of money spent is about half if you're able to have big networks. Because now you can have your wind where it's actually windy, and you can have your sun where it's actually sunny. It's kind of logical, right? But also in the US, and I understood the same as in Colombia, and the same as in Europe, we don't get any big transmission networks built. It's very hard to get them built. So these kind of statistics, they show you it's really, really valuable. Are these, all this opposition against those networks actually worth the amount of additional money spent? Maybe yes, maybe no, but somebody has to show the numbers. What we also see all across the world is that networks are massively congested. Here you can see in Europe and in the US, the amount of capacity of wind and solar that is willing to connect, but they just cannot because the network is just full, massive. Here you can see a map of the Netherlands showing in red where no generator can be connected anymore. The Netherlands is not very big. This is about half of the country where you can just not connect anything anymore because they don't have enough networks. So what that means is that we come from a paradigm where you had generation asking and networks following. We need to go to a paradigm where networks are proactively invested in, and then generation will come. We already see that in Texas, and we already see that in different parts of the EU, especially offshore. Because I also understood that there is an idea to have a lot of offshore. Well, there you really need coordination between networks and generation like you never had before. Now, what is also important is the distribution side of things. We come from a world where the distribution networks was something that you just put some copper in the ground, you don't look at it anymore, and then the moment you need to put some more copper in the ground, well, just open it up, put some more. There's more and more value from actively managing the distribution network and actively managing the load. Because if you're able to let the load work in synchrony or in harmony with the power system as a whole, again, a lot of costs are saved. And a lot of those investments in networks will go to distribution networks. That is because of electrical vehicles, because of heat pumps, because of solar PV panels on the roofs, and so on. So if we just act stupid and let everybody charge their car when they want, heat their house when they want, feed in as much solar as they want in any area, you'll have a massive overinvestment into networks. So what is happening around the world is you actually have sort of markets at local level, where you start engaging with local DRs in order to create local issues so you don't have to build out as much as you would have if you don't use these assets. This is from the US, this is from different places in Europe. Now, my conclusions. So the world is electrifying in order to attain the decarbonization goals. And also, actually, often it's very cheap, these new wind and solar. So we expect massive amount of investment in generation. Highest volume of those will be in renewable generation. We already see that today. It's just a matter of time. We already, right now in the world, 12% of electricity is generated by wind and solar, 12%. That was 0% 20 years ago. In Europe, right now, more than 20% is generated by wind and sun. In US, 13% of electricity is produced by wind and sun. So we'll be, besides massive investment into generation, we'll see massive investment into networks, especially distribution networks. And we can do something about not having to overinvest. The power system, if you look at the energy system as a whole, it becomes the central entity from today at world level about 20% of energy being delivered by electricity, in the next decades will go to 60, 70% of final energy being delivered by electricity. So the power system is the vital energy vector. Spot markets, and I think Colombia has already quite an advanced spot markets, they will become vital, more than today, to coordinate supply, demand, storage, and the network. A lot of renewables will be entering, a lot of investment will be entering. They don't want to depend their business case on these very volatile spot markets. They're very volatile spot markets, they're key to coordinate. They're not necessarily key to build your business case on. So how to ensure that we have an adequate system, a reliable system, and an affordable system? This is really the key question where everybody in the world is struggling with. So you are not alone. So adequacy, what we see is a more and more of an important role for capacity mechanisms. Right now, the European Commission has been proposed the revisiting of the electricity market design. There has been a central role for capacity mechanisms. They have been very important in terms of revenue ranging between a few percent to 50% of revenues of generators. Colombia is right in the middle. But what we see is the way that these capacity mechanisms are designed is done very different from one country to another. I know that you here have reliability options. I think that's a very advanced design. Maybe I'm supposed to say that because my colleagues invented them, but they can always still be improved, but it's one of the better designs in the world. Reliability, we have taken certain things for granted. Voltage control, inertia, ramping, we have taken it for granted because we have so many generators who could do it. They will become more scarce. If you don't pay them for these services, they will not deliver. Your system will become into grid or security issues. Affordability, we see all over the world price shocks happening. We had the European gas price shock. I didn't mention it, but in the US, there has also been massive price shocks. Think about the Texas issue. Think about the storms last winter. These create periods of very high prices, which then attract a lot of public attention, attract political attention, with the risk that you destroy everything else and the system will become more expensive than it could have been. So you need mechanisms to ensure affordability, and what we propose is just one mechanism. I think just putting a price cap on the power market or so on would be a very bad idea. They tried to do that in Australia last summer, and Australia was so close to a massive blackout because some generators just said, if my price is capped, I'm not generating anymore, bye-bye, and then the system is just going down. So you need something more intelligent than that. What I also said is investment into big transmission lines and the digitalization of distribution systems, they will make attaining those three criteria a lot easier. So a lot of work has to be done there to make that actually, maybe not even a lot easier, to just make it feasible, which is very different from making it easier. So this was my presentation. I would like to thank you very much for your attention.